It begins with genius. An inner voice guides a poet's rhyme, an author's words, or the painter's brush. A calling from the soul, the heart, the mind, the senses slowly transforms into art, bringing the artist's world into existence. This new world invites and challenges its viewers to enter and experience the artist's personal vision. It's a vision that often goes unrecognized and unappreciated. It's a gift to the world, but it is sometimes dependent upon a simple twist of fate. Such is the story of Earl Cunningham, the Dragon of St. George Street.
Cunningham's pictures are magical. The more you live with them, the more you look at them, the more you find in them to enjoy.
Being a folk artist doesn't mean being a simple artist. And Cunningham, like a lot of folk artists, has a fairly elaborated idea of what he's doing.
He appears to be exceedingly simple when you first look at him, but the more one looks, the more one finds that this Eden is populated with a variety of forces, a variety of ideals.
I think that he had a genius, that the spontaneity that he worked with and the consistency within that he worked with, and his ability to reconcile these dualities of abstract color and highly detailed sort of representation, that it came completely naturally to him.
Earl was really attuned, to the underlying patterns of nature. And to me, that suggests that he was a very visual person who was very discerning as he looked out in the world.
He has total continuity in the expression of his feelings. He's a visionary.
I think as we come to think about his work more, look at it more, we will understand that he is a brilliant modernist.
There's an old saying about the prophet's never loved in his own country, or the artist is never loved in his own country. And if there was ever a case of that, this is a good example of that with Earl Cunningham.
The term artistic genius is usually reserved for classically trained masters. But today, an exciting new interest in contemporary art has created a movement to recognize the genius of a uniquely different kind of artistic expression. Critics and curators have tried on various labels: outsider art, primitive, art brut, naive, visionary, all attempts to describe the paintings, sculptures, and crafts that now keep company with Monets, Picassos, and Rembrandts in America's most prominent museums and galleries. Broadly labeled American folk art, it's become the mainstream of American artistic expression, a true measure of the strength and durability of our culture, capturing our personal hopes and dreams. And marking Earl Cunningham as one of the most important American artists of the 20th century.
Sometimes I think you feel like you've got to attach labels to people, but I think he was just truly an original, and that's his genius. He's different. His work is totally different than your average so-called folk artist.
Influenced by a quilt of literature, geography, pop culture, past personal experiences, and dreams, Cunningham's mastery revolved around creating a world rich in spatial illusions, vibrant colors, and unexpected textures.
What he's doing is he's creating a world that never existed, a world that he would like to exist, a utopian universe that brings together elements of his childhood together with elements of fantasy. The elements of childhood have to do with some scenes of Maine, others with his experiences in Florida. However, what he does is he changes the scale tremendously. So scale is dependent upon what is important to Earl Cunningham. So if he's fascinated by a bird, for example, the bird is as large as a house. The problem is a lot of people look at someone like Earl Cunningham and they want to trivialize him as being cute and charming and merely delightful. And my theory is there's much more going on with Earl Cunningham. In creating an American Eden, what he's doing is he's creating an idealistic beginning for both him and for the nation.
We can trace Earl Cunningham's beginnings to the rural coast of Maine in the late 19th century. Born Erland Ronald Cunningham on June 30th, 1893, he was the third of 6 children born to Charles and Elwilda Drake Cunningham. This Boothbay farmhouse was his childhood home. As a child, he worked in the fields and sold vegetables at the family's roadside stand. Today, Robert Cunningham, Earl's nephew, continues to work the same farm.
Back then, it was almost catch as catch can as far as making money. I mean, you farmed, you fished, or you cut wood. And that was almost getting into the size of what there was to do back then. And I think most any fellow was 13 or 14 years old would get a little bit tired of that after a while.
Earl had a broad streak of independence, and he was eager to make his own way in the world. Instilled with New England values and appreciation for nature and a strong work ethic, he decided at age 13 to set out on his own. Earl took to the road, becoming a tinker and peddler, traveling from farmhouse to farmhouse, mending something here or selling something there. By 1909, young Cunningham was living in a fisherman's shack on Staten Island off the coast of Maine. It was there, at the age of 15, that he painted his first seascapes on driftwood that washed up onto the shore. He sold them for 50 cents each. His tinkering drew him into mechanics, and in 1912 he graduated from the Hamlin Foster School of Automobile Engineering in Portland, Maine. Although now occasionally working on cars, his passion for painting continued, and by 1914 the price for his crude works rose to $8, a grand sum for the time. But making ends meet was not an easy task, and in the early 1900s Earl often found work on the docks in Boothbay. It was during this time that fate handed him an opportunity that would greatly influence his art. His mechanical abilities and love of adventure landed him a job on one of the schooners, where he learned to sail and listen to tales of ocean lore. His enthusiasm for sailing would remain with him throughout his life. Today, Boothbay is still a safe harbor for all kinds of boats, a theme often repeated in Cunningham's paintings. Cunningham's love of the open sea grew, and soon he purchased a sailboat of his own, enabling him to venture beyond his childhood world. At 17, he began what would become the first of many adventures by sailing from Maine to New York. He studied coastal navigation and received a government license as a pilot of harbors and rivers, using his sailboat to guide the larger ships through the tricky harbors.
I almost feel Cunningham's art is a kind of journey. He was himself a boat captain and was licensed to run boats up and down the East Coast. And one has that sense always that he's on a journey. There's a lot of water in his work, a lot of boats, a lot of coastal scenes, a lot of trees and marshes and birds that would have lived along the coast anywhere from Maine to Florida. It's an area he knew really well. So what seems sometimes repetitive in its large compositional sense turns out to have some very specific references. You might see saltbox houses on the coast if you're looking at one of the scenes from Maine. If you're down looking at a scene from St. Augustine, you might be looking at Seminole Indian camps. So there's really a lot of local reference in his work, even while overall they tend to be marshes, boats, rivers, coastal scenes, trees, storms, sunsets, in a way that might at first seem repetitive.
Drawing on his many adventures, Cunningham painted mostly from memories, but not by recreating awkward transcriptions of childhood, but by forging them into a new reality, creating a world that existed only in his mind.
Earl Cunningham's style, which is very uniquely his own. I can say that once you see an Earl Cunningham painting, the next time you see one, you'll know it is by him. He has a very consistent way of making paintings. He uses a lot of pattern. You know, birds that will be all lined up. There'll be a little row of flamingos beside a lagoon. There'll be boats patterned in specific ways. Ultimately, it's kind of a modernist look to the things because it seems like the space is very much up-tilted. There is not a huge amount of depth between the foreground and the front of the painting and the sky or the horizon line that should be many miles away, but seems not to be. It seems higher, not farther.
Cunningham's refined and masterful use of color and design depicts details not usually seen in folk art, and his sketches show that he planned his compositions. Many have come to call him an American fauve.
The fauve painters were known as the wild beast in France in the early 20th century, and one of the most important fauve artists is Matisse. And I began thinking about if someone is semi-literate, who has an antique shop, who's sort of out looking at various objects, there would be tons of reproductions of Van Gogh, of Matisse, of Picasso. So he would have seen reproductions of these works. So that when we look at the strong color comes much more from the French fauves, or the intense yellows come from Van Gogh, whereas some of the ideas of the charming, delightful figures may come from Grandma Moses. Really believed intensely what he was doing, but he was also sophisticated enough to take it from a number of different sources. He's an artist who made a business card, for example. He had his own coat of arms. He had an antique shop in which he presented his paintings in the form of a museum. He was looking for various forms of legitimization. But in terms of looking for these ways of legitimizing who he is, he transgressed the realm of what we think is folk art.
While working out of Portland, Maine, he met the person who would share his adventures for the next 2 decades. Earl met Iva Moses, a piano teacher, and fell in love. And on June 29, 1915, Earl and Iva were married. Soon after their marriage, they purchased a 35-foot cabin cruiser and named it the Hakona, which Cunningham featured in this painting. Living at sea and houseboats became a frequent subject of his works. Throughout the 1920s, Earl and Iva wintered in this house in St. Augustine, Florida, collecting and sending items to his brother in Maine to be sold when the Cunninghams returned in the summer. Even though they spent much of their time in Florida, Earl and Iva still considered Maine their home. They kept a house in Freeport, frequently visiting Earl's hometown and relatives. Letters written to his brother's family document travels and business dealings, and show his sense of humor.
Paul, this was last week's catch. You could not catch this many in all your life. ERC, the trapper.
We are both well. This lighthouse is almost a 6-minute walk from where we live. We haven't been excited yet. Iva.
Dear brother, we had a ride in this machine. We are in Canada, both well and seeing sights. Earl.
February 25th, 1924. Brother Paul, Earl asked me this morning to write you. Hope I'll remember everything he told me to tell you. Am sending in this letter a money order of $8, also a bill of loading for a barrel we sent. Please write and let us know how much the freight was and in just what condition the barrel was in. Put it with the rest of our things in the barn and don't open it. Also write what your price is for getting it. Per orders of Captain Cunningham, he wants to know all these things if he sends another barrel. Love from E and I.
Dear brother, we are resting here for a couple of days. Just came from Florida. Very warm. Earl.
Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the couple led a gypsy existence, traveling widely in their truck and preserving memories in photographs and later in his paintings. On this photograph, dated July 1921, Cunningham wrote, "Mohawk Trail, Mass., Driago, the Good Barge, our camp car." It's interesting to note that Cunningham refers to his truck as the Good Barge, a marine vessel. In 1936, Iva and Earl sold their Freeport, Maine home, and soon after, their marriage ended in divorce. For the next 35 years, Earl Cunningham disappeared from his family's view. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Cunningham continued traveling and painting. His style kept evolving as he used his art to reaffirm his relationship with his adventurous past, and even more important, with his dreams. At the outbreak of World War II, Cunningham was living on a farm in Waterboro, South Carolina. Seizing the opportunity to make money off of the war effort, he converted the land into a chicken farm, hired 5 employees, and raised 9,000 broilers for the Army. His art was put on hold. When the war ended, Cunningham, now determined to concentrate on his painting, moved to St. Augustine, where he and Iva had spent so many winters. It was 1949, and Cunningham had the good fortune to meet Theresia Paff, who owned and lived in a building on St. George Street. Cunningham and the 51-year-old Miss Paff hit it off, and she offered him the ground floor of the building to use as his home and gallery. Cunningham opened the Over Fork Gallery, a combination antique and curio shop. It had space enough for him to finally concentrate on his art. To the locals, he quickly became known as a curmudgeon, a grumpy, aging antiques dealer who would turn customers away on a whim and lock his shop doors in the middle of the day. And although proudly displaying his paintings in the shop's windows, a sign proclaimed, "Nothing for sale." In her article, Times Journal magazine feature writer Cynthia Parks described the shop as follows.
The shop is rusty brown with age, the light from the yellowish bulb trapped within the cloudy window. The rich smell is an accumulation of years of varnish and wood shavings, for here Cunningham cuts and paints frames for his paintings and roughs out pine gabriels, angel weather vanes. The finished ones swing crudely overhead, blowing trumpets. But like Gant in Wolfe's Look Homeward Angel, Cunningham has unfinished angels piled near his saw. The third room off the hall, also closed to all but an elect, has a wall almost solidly hung with metal. Brass hatches, doorknobs, a cymbal, bells, fan blades, a copper ventilator. Another cabinet is full of little boxes with pulleys, brass rings for sails, nuts, and bolts. Mostly the gear seems to be for boats. It feels as though a complete vessel is here, only it is not yet assembled. He is also a painter. The curious can look into that dim fourth room, closed, of course, but we enter from the hall. The room is a gallery of his landscapes and seascapes.
There was a sign across the door that said, "You are not welcome." I can't remember. It said, "No trespassing, don't come in," whatever. And this was the door to his shop. Anyway, a lady came with a coin and tapped on the window. And he opened the door, and so I went in right behind her. And found myself in this place with old locks and keys and strange kinds of things. Cunningham himself would stand at the front door, and I saw him do this. And he had his forbidding sign up there, and he himself was rather forbidding. He had this hat kind of like Field Marshal Montgomery's beret, and a continual scowl and a big mustache. And the woman she said, "Why do you keep the door locked?" And he said, "You'd come right in here, wouldn't you, if I opened it?" And she said, "Yes." And he says, well, that explains why I keep the door locked.
His shop was a sort of a dark place. It would have been dismal to some people, but it just wasn't because Earl was there. Earl had a very good personality. His personality was the kind that if he were to walk in here now, it wouldn't take him 5 minutes to pretty much capture everybody's interest. He would do his little skips and jumps, and this was part of him. And then he'd have something interesting to ask you. Earl was a great person for asking questions, already knowing the answer.
The antique shop that he had in St. Augustine was arranged in I think, a symbolic and almost a ceremonial fashion. This is a man who needed and wanted and loved order. And if he wanted to invite someone to come into the museum, he would ask the people who were not invited to leave the antique shop He would put up a sign saying closed. He would lock the door, and then he would take them into the fourth room. In other words, they were taken into the inner sanctum, which comprised his museum.
Drawn by the emotional authenticity of Cunningham's paintings, renowned photographer Jerry Uelsmann was one of the few people Earl let into his life. Uelsmann, whose photographs and darkroom techniques would later revolutionize the photo industry, was a frequent visitor to the Overfork Gallery in the late 1960s.
This gave him a way of functioning on this earth. And, you know, he invented this gallery with its crest, and he determined who could come in and go out and what, you know, and many people, I had been in there when people would come in and just look around and quickly leave because it just didn't make sense what they were seeing. Yet in his mind, it was a very structured sort of environment that he had created to allow him to, you know, have this image of himself as an artist. It was just, he was sort of insecure about his interface with the outside world, yet I think very secure in terms of his role. He had certainly no self-doubt, you know, about his art. I love the fact that he had enough self-confidence that, you know, he would put these paintings in the window, and there was, you know, a kind of energy that they had. It wasn't based on what was happening in the art world, that's for sure.
As Cunningham continued creating art, the relationship with his landlady, Tees Paff, became a topic of rumors and gossip. Her family, and many of St. Augustine's close-knit Catholic community, considered their relationship scandalous.
And Teresa Paff was a maiden lady, who was a Catholic. They had a lot of Catholics here at that time. And she evidently sort of took care of him. And she told me one time, well, no matter what the gossip is, he keeps his feet under the breakfast table all the time. And, but there was a feeling against Miss Paff in town here. And that's in the early days, and there was just too much gossip that he shouldn't be living with her. She told me at the time, she said, I paid for all his clothes, for all his food, but the town was very much against her, and the talk was that she was almost as though she had a scarlet A painted on her.
Public opinion didn't sway Cunningham's faith in his artistic talents or his growing affection for Tees Paff. He continued painting, his relationship with Tees providing him with the opportunity to follow his dream. A letter found after her death demonstrates Miss Paff's refusal to let the town's gossip and religious strictures get in the way of her love.
Dear Earl, please read this carefully and take your time to think it over, and don't say no until you have. All my love, Tees. Now, this is not to have my way, but to show this town and these people that we can do what we started out to do. I will have to put my pride deep down in my pocket to go to talk to the priest here. We do not have to be married in St. Augustine, but it would cost less here than having the expenses of going away. Marrying in the church will not stop me from going 6 months or a year on your houseboat if you want to go. This is not trying to buy or bribe you. I just want to give you and I security in the years ahead.
I know that he and his landlady became very close and wanted to get married, and of course she was a devout Catholic, and he wasn't. Though he did go down to the church and went to confirmation classes. After the second time, he had had an argument with whoever was teaching the class, a priest or whoever, and so he never was confirmed. He would tell me that he just couldn't agree with what the priest had to say.
It's not clear why they never married. They shared a dream of building a life together and living on a houseboat. Although the houseboat appears in several paintings, it was never actually built. Cunningham received his first national recognition through a chance encounter in 1961.
He was in his shop one morning, and a couple of men appeared outside the windows, and they had suits on and hats. And Earl said this wasn't the normal costume to wear on St. George Street in St. Augustine, Florida. But about the time that he noticed them, 2 more came in, and they looked the shop up and down, and he thought at that point that he might be being raided, he said. He just had no idea. And Earl could be sort of childish when he wanted to be, and he was sort of afraid what was going on. And at that point, he said, in walked Jacqueline Kennedy, and he recognized her immediately. And it dawned on him that these were her guards. She obviously had heard about her shop. She looked at some paintings. Earl showed her paintings, and she ended up picking out one. And Earl said that painting, while she was still in the White House, hung in the White House. And he was very proud of that.
On May 9th, 1961, Cunningham received a thank you letter from Letitia Baldridge, Jackie Kennedy's social secretary.
On behalf of Mrs. Kennedy, I would like to thank you for your thoughtfulness in sending her your original painting, The Everglades. Since she is eager to encourage an interest in and a development of the arts in this country, you can imagine her appreciation of your work. With sincere thanks and very best wishes for your continued success.
Cunningham's painting, The Everglades, was displayed in President John Kennedy's study and later became part of the John Fitzgerald Kennedy Library collection in Boston, Massachusetts. The painting is now on loan to the Mennello Museum of American Folk Art in Orlando, Florida. Although proud of his newfound recognition, Cunningham remained adamant about keeping most of his paintings together. Money was never part of his creative motivation. In fact, he was often quoted as saying,
"I shan't be doing nothing I need money for now. The money would only go in the bank and I wouldn't see it, as I do my paintings."
A second Cunningham painting, titled Camp David, was presented to President George W. Bush in 2002 and is now displayed in a bedroom at Camp David. Unlike academically trained artists, Cunningham had little interest in the refinement of an accurate perspective or single light source. He painted what he wanted to see, not what was before him, creating his own reality.
He sometimes would paint one coconut much larger than the other coconuts on a tree. And he'd say to me, when he showed it to me, he'd point it out to me, and he'd say, "I wonder if anybody will ever notice that one's bigger than the others." And he used to take fun out of doing things like this. One of the things about Earl and his paintings was that Earl was always very proud of the fact that he painted from memory. He would continually say that when he would do a painting. He was doing this painting because it reminded him of thus and so. He did this painting because it reminded him of something else. Or he was doing a painting of an island and a river scene because it was something he'd seen in the past years ago. His paintings were always telling stories.
While the turmoil of the 1960s was changing America's political landscape, Cunningham's landscapes continued to present safe harbors from reality. Fate would continue to play a role in Cunningham's life. Another chance encounter, this time with 2 art lovers in March of 1969, would ignite the sparks that have since grown into the realization of his dream.
Back in 1969, a friend of mine asked me to drive her to St. Augustine, Florida, which I was very glad to do. And it's about a 2.5-hour drive from Winter Park. We started on St. George Street, which was then a walking street, a very dusty street in St. Augustine, and walked into this little shop that said the Overfork Gallery. And behind the counter was a little white-haired man standing there talking to a young couple. We looked in the counters and there didn't seem to be anything we wanted, so we turned around and walked out. As we walked down the sidewalk, we saw these wonderful paintings on little easels. And we both stopped in just amazement because we loved each painting, and there was a sign, and it said, "These paintings are not for sale." And they were all signed Earl Cunningham, very boldly signed. So we turned around and went back into the shop. We asked him why he wouldn't sell his paintings. He said, "Well, somebody's going to come along one of these days, and they're going to give me $40,000 for all my paintings, and they're going to go in a museum." Well, he said, "If you were going to choose a painting, which one would you choose?" So, hearts beating very fast, we said, "Oh my goodness." So we looked up and down the wall, and my friend Jane Dart made her selection. and I decided on mine. Mine had a beautiful pale violet sea, ships in the sea, little people doing things. It was just charming. I loved it. And when I got home, I couldn't get the paintings out of my mind. They were absolutely charming. And I said to myself, you know, these paintings would make a wonderful show for our art museum.
Marilyn's chance encounter with Earl Cunningham and her keen appreciation of art were the seeds that would later bloom in one of her life's most important missions, helping the Dragon of St. George Street realize his dream. Because of her efforts, Earl Cunningham's art was officially introduced to the world on May 31st, 1970, in Orlando, Florida, in an exhibit titled The Paintings of Earl Cunningham.
It's a mistake to imagine that somehow the professionals are going to get there first each time, because we just don't. So I think one of the wonderful parts of the story here is it's very likely that Earl Cunningham would have worked right up until his death without any serious recognition, but for Marilyn Mennello. And her openness and responsiveness is so typical of wonderful collectors all around the country who have found artists of importance and given them some validation before they died.
Most often painting on masonite boards, Cunningham chose to work on several paintings at once. He created in clusters, making only slight changes in each successive painting, as if trying to elaborate on a single vision or capture fresh ideas.
He tended to paint in layers. There are sort of bottom layers that he then adds things to the top of, and you don't want to smear the wet paint. So you let one layer dry before you add another, or you let one corner sort of settle and see how that looks before you actually finish the next corner, because what you think you may want to do in another part of the painting may change depending upon how this actually comes out once you begin. So for Cunningham to work on multiple canvas or multiple panels at the same time is probably not unusual.
Working on multiple paintings at once, approaching the technique in a way in which he would mingle paints or paint over something or scratch into something is a way of trying to achieve his goal. He's doing it largely through intuition. He's got an idea of what he wants and he's searching for a way to express it. An academically trained artist will have a method that has been taught and learned over the centuries or the decades and taught and handed down, and in some ways it's a more resolved way of painting. Cunningham is a searcher. He's searching for a way to get his ideas across with the look that he wants and the surface that he wants and the vivid quality that he wants. So I think we'd be doing him a disservice to say it's a simple approach to art.
Numerous patterns appear in his paintings. Seascapes of New England and Florida, Indians, Viking ships, covered bridges, lighthouses, animals, and trains. Some symbolize his desire for peaceful coexistence, which is also found in the paintings of folk artist Edward Hicks. Beginning in the 1820s, Hicks created over 100 paintings depicting a peaceful kingdom where fierce and defenseless animals lead a harmonious coexistence. Cunningham's paintings, although more intuitive, reveal a similar desire for tranquility.
People have frequently said with Earl Cunningham that what he is he's a marine painter. And I would dispute that and say, no, I don't think he's a marine painter at all. What I think he's actually doing is painting safe harbors. And he starts off paintings generally from the view of the safe harbor that is looking out to the sea. Whereas if you start from the harbor, you have this very protective area. Harbors are also wonderful places of negotiation. So if you're negotiating your present and your past, your own world and your ideal world, the harbor and a safe harbor is a perfect way of doing this. There's also an idealization that occurs with these harbor scenes because he has children fishing and playing. He also has beautiful schooners that are right outside the area of the harbor, as well as a whole host of houses around them, flowers, and then plenty of birds.
Some of the other things that we should point out about Earl's work include the fact that many of these pictures have central focal points. if you look at them, there's usually some detail, some element that's in the center of the picture in the background. It can be a boat, it can be a separate little island with certain things on it, etc. But he tends to do that. He also tends to sort of line things up.
Unlike most other folk artists, Cunningham made sketches before painting final versions. Over 50 of his sketches survive and illustrate an attention to detail and composition. He was very serious about his color choices. He painted in vivid colors unrelated to reality. His painting Nassau Sound clearly demonstrates his masterly use of Van Gogh colors. His imagery teases the viewer by breaking the rules of scale, wind direction, and time to create his personal vision of the world.
He loved reflections in the water, and you get that magical mirroring that comes when he does a four-masted schooner reflected completely in the water below. I think he also was fascinated with shadows, and there are certain pictures where you see him almost entirely focused on capturing that sense of light and shadow. Tree trunks that are casting long, dark streaks across the water or the land. There are scenes in which the light is coming through the foliage in a group of trees in a forest, and you get these zinging rays of light shooting across the canvas as if he is observing something that, of course, each of us has observed from time to time, but he's trying to really get it down in paint. He has quite a wonderful sense of scale. The things that are most important are the biggest. And this can vary from picture to picture. So a boat might be very tiny or enormous, depending on its role within the painting. This is almost an Egyptian understanding of how to make art, where the things we care about most should take up the most space. It's a kind of intuitive way to make art, and it, of course, is instantaneously communicative. There's no one looking at these artworks who feels bewildered about what really matters here. I find it quite rewarding to look at, and I love the fact that the birds are always too big, and on every bird the eyes are too large, and they have a kind of staring quality that I find is completely charming and gives them a sense of animation and life that you'd never get if he were being more naturalistic. Of course, if he had been trained academically, he'd know better than to do that. So aren't we grateful that he wasn't?
While it's common among artists to let clients and dealers determine how their works are framed, Cunningham believed that frames were a crucial element to each painting, often using them to extend the painting beyond its borders. He built all the frames for his paintings himself. Using a variety of woods, he would often decorate them with colorful, free-form shapes and patterns, then varnish many to a high-gloss finish. The heavy frames may seem imposing, but their sheer size and boldness create a divider, separating his world from its surroundings. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, Cunningham continued to find refuge in his paintings. His collection provides a psychologically reassuring life raft from the difficulties that he faced in St. Augustine. Cunningham continued to feel persecuted, not only because of the gossip about his relationship with Teese, but because he was against the closing off of St. George Street to make it into a commercial tourist area. He began to suspect that there was a conspiracy there among the merchants and realtors to get rid of him. As personal pressure increased, he began recording his observations and feelings of persecution in his diary.
Mr. Sullivan in my store telling me if things keep going as they are, someone's going to get killed. That meant me. They are getting together in large crowds, men and women and kids, and sending them into my place to make trouble for me. I can't watch them all. They are taking things from the store. I'm losing every day. One of their men came to me, telling me to get my things out of this building this week, for they're gonna burn it on Sunday. Arson! They could not scare me by threatening to burn me out, so they're gonna shut me off from coming or going. They want this building.
At times, he felt ineffectual. He noted in his scrapbook that in November of 1971, he had told Teese that he would be moving in 2 years. Instead of taking his statement seriously, she laughed at him.
Now she has got her family all back again. That means the end of me. I will not live through what I had to live through at the first of my coming here. I know not how much longer I can stand it. I'm slowly giving up.
Even as he became more paranoid, his paintings portrayed a peaceful existence.
Well, if things are looked at closely, I would say they probably tell us quite a bit about him. I just think there's a kind of passion for nature and for celebrating it and intensifying it that's extremely appealing, extremely attractive. I don't think he shows what you read about him as the personality, which is his difficulties and his paranoia. He basically paints a very ideal, Edenic world where everything is at peace for the most part, and all the parts cohabitate and get along well, where, you know, the natural world is an extraordinarily beautiful thing. And I think that's the main lesson that you get from his art. It's just how beautiful the world is.
35 years had passed since Earl's last contact with his family, who had given him up for dead. His nephew, Robert Cunningham, remembers bringing in the mail in 1972 and seeing a package addressed to his father from his Uncle Earl.
In 1937 was when he left here. Sometime after May is about all I really know about that. And we never heard a thing from him at all until somewhere around 1970, I can't remember the exact date now, 72 I think it was. And I went to the mail one morning to bring up the mail to the house to Father and Mother. There was a newspaper all rolled up with an envelope taped around it, addressed to my father. So I took it up and I gave it to Father. Father opened it up, and I don't remember the name of the newspaper, but it was from St. Augustine, I believe. And it was all about Uncle Erland. What he was doing, the Overfort Gallery, you know, somewhat about his paintings, and a little bit of everything. First we'd heard of him since 37. And I talked with my father about going down to see him. I said, don't you think that, because we suspected that he might have already been dead over the, you know, so long. And when I found that out, I asked Father, I said, do you think we ought to go down and visit with him, Father? And he said, no. Hey, the man's been gone all these years. Don't you think you know, it would be nice to renew old acquaintances? And Father said, no. He said, the newspaper was addressed to me. He said, there was nothing said about correspondence. And he said, this was Uncle Erland's way of letting us all know up here that he was alive and well. If he'd have wanted company and wanted to have heard from us, he'd have said so.
At 79, Earl was slowing down, but he remained adamant about keeping his body of work together, and he was determined to reach his goal of 1,000 paintings. But Cunningham's paranoia and the town's gossip were taking their toll. His relationship with Tisse was becoming more combative. In September of 1972, she told him to vacate the Overfort Gallery building on St. George Street by the first of the new year. But this wasn't the end of their relationship. In 1973, Tisse purchased a house on the corner of Hope Street and US 1, with enough room for Cunningham to open a new Overfort Gallery and continue to paint. Ironically, today the house, where Cunningham lived and eventually died, is owned by an artist who also loves to paint landscapes and wildlife.
His work is really distinctive. It's a style that's very unique, and it's more difficult to do the primitive, I think, than do realism. Realism, you just paint what you see. The primitive, you paint what you feel, and it's, I have to admire that. When we first moved here, we were experiencing some odd things that we couldn't really find an explanation to. There used to be a door going from the gallery that we're in now into, I understand was his workroom. And we at that time had it as a little small living room. And we would be sitting in there, and that door would just swing open. I mean, like somebody just slammed it open. And this happened a lot of times. There was no explanation for it because there's no breeze coming through or anything like that because this place is enclosed. But so after we found out a little bit more about the background of the house, that Mr. Cunningham had actually lived here and also had died here, then we, after we somewhat got used to the fact that these things would happen, we just started, it was kind of a joke that, oh, don't pay any attention to that, that's just Mr. Cunningham coming through.
For the next 5 years, as Cunningham continued to paint, his health slowly deteriorated. He was riddled with anxieties and became more paranoid, tormented by real and imaginary problems. This picture of Earl and Teese was taken on Christmas, 1977. Just 4 days later, while Teese Paff was out with friends, Earl Cunningham decided it was once again time to move on. At 84 years old, he walked through his gallery to his bedroom, and sitting on the edge of his bed, he placed a gun to his head and ended his life.
I feel that Earl was a very contented and happy person no matter what he did. The way Earl felt was that you take your walk, you do your thing, you leave the marks you can to please people, and then you can sit down smiling because your job is done and you have contributed. Earl felt as though he were contributing, and of course he was. And if you look at his paintings with that in mind, you'll really enjoy them. You'll enjoy them a great deal. And then you can begin to picture a gray-haired man with a mustache, an old sloppy mustache, sitting there, smiling, because he had done a good job.
His job done, Earl Cunningham would have most likely never been heard of again, if it were not for another simple twist of fate. 14 years after Marilyn Mennello purchased her first Cunningham painting, her daughter was visiting St. Augustine and wanted to purchase a second Cunningham painting for her mother's birthday.
I had a call in the afternoon from St. Augustine, and a very tearful voice said, "There aren't any paintings here of Earl Cunningham." And you know, Mother, he died in 1977, so this was 84. She said, nobody seems to know where this great collection went, and maybe somebody will come up with something about him. So 6 weeks later, the phone rang one night about 9 o'clock in the evening, and a voice on the other end of the phone said, I understand you're interested in Cunningham paintings. And I said, I certainly am. I would love to buy one. Do you have a painting by Earl Cunningham? I have 62 paintings, and I will sell no less than 62. I want to get Earl Cunningham out of my life.
On the phone was Teese Paff's nephew, who was no fan of Earl Cunningham. His offer to sell 62 Cunninghams took Marilyn and Michael by surprise. After viewing pictures of the paintings sent by Mr. Paff, Marilyn and Michael realized that with Earl Cunningham, you couldn't choose just one.
The most exciting moment, I must say, during all of the collecting of Cunningham was when we went to pick up the 62 paintings. And when you saw the array of paintings, my heart just started to beat. I could not believe what a genius he was. And God, I just was in there looking, and I really felt I was looking at all of the fauves like Matisse and Flamenc and Van Gogh and so forth. And it was just enlightening. And I knew it was an inspiration, and I knew he was probably someone without a doubt that we should really put all our efforts and love to, and we did.
Like detectives trying to piece together a great mystery, the Mennellos spent the following decade tracking down as many Cunninghams as possible.
My husband Michael said, now listen, what are you going to do with these? I said, I am going to call museums, and I'm going to tour these paintings. I want the world to see these pictures.
As the Mennellos prepared to present the paintings to the world, they brought in Bonnie Jones to restore the Cunninghams to their original splendor.
Well, when I saw the first group of 60 paintings that we were looking at, and Dr. Robert Bishop was looking at, and we were getting ready for an exhibition in New York, they were extremely dull. They had been scratched. They had bug droppings on them, so they just had to be cleaned, and they were cleaned with very gentle solvents and enzymes. We were taking off light layers of varnish and layers of dirt. I really enjoyed working with Earl Cunningham's paintings simply because it was such a large collection that you had time to study and really get in depth with the work. Normally I restore 1 or 2 paintings by a particular artist, maybe 10, but when you work on 300 or more paintings, you get to know the artist and you feel for him. And Earl has given us a world that has just challenged my mind. I mean, he is as poetic as William Blake, who I love, and Earl Cunningham is right up there with the poetry of painting. He's like our Van Gogh right here in Florida.
Between 1986 and 2000, the Mennellos introduced Cunningham's genius to America through a series of 30 one-man exhibits, while continuing to add to the collection, which now numbers over 300 paintings. In 1998, the Mennello Museum of American Folk Art was established in Orlando, Florida. Earl Cunningham's dream of having his paintings purchased and exhibited together in a permanent exhibit was finally realized.
We're all beginning to look at Cunningham from a different perspective, and we're not looking at him so much as a folk painter anymore, but we're looking at him as the link between perhaps American traditional folk art painting and 20th century American modernism. I think the importance of the Mennello Museum rests on several factors. One, that it's one of only 4 museums in the United States dedicated to the subject of folk art, with a permanent home for the largest collection of Earl Cunningham paintings anywhere in the United States. And at the same time, since so much 20th century folk art was created in the South, we have focused on buying Southern folk art to complement the major collection and the body of work of Cunningham.
We know how important Earl Cunningham is to American art and folk art in particular. It was my privilege to be able to make the announcement of adding Earl Cunningham to the Florida Artists Hall of Fame. I was just enthralled by Earl Cunningham's paintings and the vibrancy of them. And I think what I love about folk art is the fact that so many people will look at a piece of folk art and say, I can do that. Now, while we know we probably can't do what an Earl Cunningham or other folk artists do, we have a connection with that art.
And what's interesting about him is, for me, is that he, knowingly or unknowingly, and I suspect it's a combination of both, sort of took this tradition and made it completely new, but he really did make it original and make it contemporary. I think that you could compare him to some of Hartley's seascapes. I mean, there are really a lot of people that he fits in with, and yet is really good enough to also, again and again, distinguish himself from them.
Today, Cunningham's work is displayed in museum collections throughout the country, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Museum of American Folk Art, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum.
Here at the Smithsonian, we are interested in collecting and presenting the very best artworks possible to tell the story of this country in all of its richness. And an artist like Cunningham is right on point. He can show us a lot of specific things about his experiences in his decades up and down the East Coast, along the rivers as a riverboat captain, recording what he saw and what he felt. They help us find how we became the society we are. And they help us individually just by virtue of knowing what we respond to, what we like, what we care about. They help us locate where we are today.
Cunningham had embarked on a creative odyssey that motivated him to sift, evaluate, and transform memories, experiences, impressions, and observations into works of art. He was an artist in search of security, self-awareness, and immortality. His use of color was prudent, if not downright audacious, while his sense of pictorial composition was freewheeling, combining variously scaled elements from different times, places, and cultures. He worked from an inner vision. His paintings exude an emphatic sense of America's natural wonders and history, painting things not as they appeared before him, but as he imagined they should be. There's little doubt that Cunningham was a deliberating artist. Mother Nature showed him the extremes, the subtleties, and the possibilities. Cunningham relished exaggeration because it suited his pictorial, interpretive, and psychological ends, shaping a view of the world that was not only imaginary, but utopian in its idealism. In the words of the late Robert Bishop, former director of the Museum of American Folk Art in New York, Cunningham is truly a great painter, Today, his work remains at the forefront of the historical fantasy evolution of 20th century American folk art. In 2007, when the Smithsonian American Art Museum reopens, the paintings of Earl Cunningham will be featured in a one-man exhibit. It will travel the country, providing an opportunity for people throughout America to enjoy his genius.